Suppression, mass murder. These swept across the nation, all under one symbol. It was found everywhere. On the arms men marching through the streets, on flags, posters, and flyers, this emblem, intruding upon every aspect of society, was hailed with shouts of adoration. This was the swastika. Secretly, some were appalled. They could not stand by and watch the injustice, and so another symbol emerged. This came to represent purity, goodness, and freedom in a land and time where these three were severely lacking. This was the white rose. Today I want to tell you a story about a few college students who wholeheartedly believed in the idea of doing what's right because it's right, and not worrying about the results. This is the story of the White Rose Resistance. All information in this speech, unless otherwise noted, is taken from the book A Noble Treason by Richard Hansard. Our story begins in Nazi Germany, in the year 1933. It does not start with the political turmoil in Berlin, however. It starts with a 15-year-old and a 12-year-old in Ulm, Germany. Their names were Hans and Sophie Scholl, both proud supporters of National Socialism. Hans joined the Hitler Youth and Sophie the League of German Girls. These programs were leagues of indoctrination and training, but to Hans and Sophie, they simply represented a way to support their nation. Both were so dedicated to their cause that they received promotions in their leagues. Soon, however, they began to notice discrepancies between the values of Nazism and the way they had been raised. Their Christian upbringing taught them to love others, while Hitler spewed hatred at the Jews. Hans' favorite passage in the Bible, a verse from 1 Corinthians 13, said, "If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing." Hans and Sophie were also well educated, having been raised to appreciate fine literature and good art. When many of these became forbidden, they were not pleased. Their older sister, Inga Scholl, later remembered, "What were they making of our fatherland? Not a place where a new and happy life could flourish for everyone, as they had promised. No, instead they imposed one claim after another on our nation, until gradually all of us were sitting in a huge jail cell, prisoners." And so Hans and Sophie quickly grew disenchanted with Nazi ideology and refused to join the wave of political frenzy sweeping over their peers. As they grew older and the situation in Germany continued to worsen, their concern for their country increased. Hans, speaking of the Christians in Germany, said, "We will have no answer when we are asked, 'What do you do about it?'" In early 1942, Hans, now 24, and Sophie, 21, were studying at the University of Munich. Unable to stand by any longer, Hans discreetly crossed the line from passive to active resistance. His friend Alex Schmorl had helped him to write a leaflet denouncing the Nazi regime and calling out the German people for their cowardice. Across the top of the leaflet were the words, "Leaflets of the White Rose." The first White Rose leaflet says, "Who among us has any conception of the dimensions of shame that will befall us and our children when one day the veil has fallen from our eyes, and the most horrible of crimes that infinitely outdistance every human measure, reach the light of day?" They anonymously distributed copies of the leaflet throughout Munich and set to work on writing more. After describing several of the atrocities occurring in Germany, Alex and Hans posed the question, "Why tell you these things, since you are fully aware of them? Or if not of these, then of other equally grave crimes committed by this frightful subhumanity? Because here we touch on a problem which involves us deeply and forces us all to take thought. Why do the German people behave so apathetically in the face of all these abominable crimes so unworthy of the human race? Hardly anyone thinks about that." They continue to accuse the German people of their complicity in the state's actions with the words, "Each one was to be exonerated of the guilt of this kind. Each man continues on his way with the calmest, the most placid conscience, but he cannot be exonerated. No, he is guilty, guilty, guilty." Soon after the release of the leaflet, Sophie discovered that her brother was one of the authors. She insisted that he let her join them, and so the group grew to 3. The third leaflet encouraged the Germans to sabotage the war effort whenever possible, to refuse to give money to public drives, and to urge others into passive resistance. They challenged the people, saying, "Is your spirit already so crushed by abuse that you forget that it is your right, or rather, your moral duty to eliminate this system?" The fourth leaflet, exhorting the Christians to rise up and stand against the injustice around them, screamed to the readers, "We will not keep silent. We are your guilty conscience. The white rose will not leave you alone." And then the leaflets ceased for a time. Hans and Alex, who were serving as medics, received orders to move to the Russian front. While in Russia, they experienced the horrors of war firsthand. Once, Hans saw a sick Jewish girl using a heavy pick to repair a road. The girl was skinny, her face haggard, and pain shone in her eyes. When Hans took out his ration, a mixture of chocolate, dried fruit, and nuts, and gave it to the girl, she threw it at his feet. Hans picked up the ration and a wildflower from nearby and set them at the girl's feet, saying, "I only wanted to give you some pleasure." And then he walked away. When he turned to look back, the flower was in the girl's hair, and the ration had been picked up. In November 1942, Hans returned to Munich. The group that came to be known as the White Rose steadily grew, but Hans, Sophie, and Alex remained the core of the group. After they returned from Russia, the leaflets changed. While they had previously been philosophical, including classical quotations, they were now harsher and more direct, appealing not only to the intellectual community, but now also to the common Germans. The fifth leaflet discussed the end of the war and the predicted punishment for the Germans who continued to follow the Nazis. The sixth document discussed the losses of Stalingrad, the deprivation of rights, and called once again for resistance. But the distribution of the leaflets did not go unnoticed this time. Now, according to the Holocaust Education and Archive Research Team, on February 18, 1943, Hans and Sophie were distributing copies of the leaflet throughout the university, dropping stacks of copies in corridors while students were still in class. Leaving before the classes ended, the Scholls noticed that some copies remained in the suitcase they had been carrying the leaflets in. So Sophie climbed up to the top floor of the atrium and flung the leftover copies in the air. A custodian, Jacob Schmidt, saw them, and the police were called. Hans and Sophie were taken into Gestapo custody. Put on trial for high treason, there was little doubt what the verdict would be. At one point during the trial, Judge Roland Friesler questioned how any German could do with the indictment charged against them. Sophie responded, "What we did and said was also believed by many others. They just don't dare express themselves as we did. Somebody, after all, has to make a start." The verdict was read, claiming that for the protection of the people and the Reich, the sentence was the death penalty. And so, on February 24, 1943, 25-year-old Hans Fritz Scholl and 21-year-old Sophia Magdalena Scholl were beheaded. Hans' last words were yelled as he walked to his execution, "Long live freedom." I wish I could tell you that the White Rose changed the course of the war. I wish I could tell you that thousands of Jews' lives were saved as a result of the leaflets. And I wish I could say that the German people's eyes were opened, that they stood up against the injustice around them. But I can't. See, in the end, their efforts against the Nazis didn't keep the injustice around them from continuing. Facing impossible odds, the White Rose stood up for what they believed in. Why? Not because they could overthrow the system, and not because they could change the nation, but because it was right. In this, they succeeded in upholding their integrity and speaking out against injustice, in doing what was right. You see, the common thread that tied the members of the White Rose together was this: each one had a moral standard that deemed it wrong to keep silent while the government committed horrible abuses, and not one would allow themselves to violate it by passively standing by. Another man of their time who could not stay quiet, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, describes this belief: silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak, and not to act is also to act. Hans and Sophie's story, their courage, did not die with them. I'd like to leave you with the same questions that their story caused me to consider. Why do we choose to speak up, or to keep silent? Because it is right, or because we think it will make a difference? Are we willing to stand up against injustice, to stand up for what we believe is right, even when it's not going to change anything around us? White Rose taught me that I don't have to change the world. All I have to do is stand up. This group's actions were based on one simple but impactful idea: that doing what's right, because it's right, is enough. Somebody, after all, has to make a start.